how do we make it so that communities are better off because we've come in and we've found these metals that we need for our society and we've left them better off? Like how do we set that goal? Right? That's the level of thinking that's net positive. And you're just seeing more and more of that now. And it's been proven it inspires people to have a purpose and to connect to their own purpose. You know, if you've ever done that kind of hard work of like, why am I here? And it's not easy and it can change, right, over time. But if you can connect that to the purpose at work, then you really have something. You know, if you can say, here's what I'm kind of uniquely good at, it's that, I think that Japanese phrase, ikigai, you know, where it's like, what am I good at? What does the world need? What can I get paid for? You know, those kind of overlapping things. If you can figure that out and then say, how do I bring that to my work? You're pretty engaged. And I think you'll generally do better in your work, in your career. So it really does come down to, what am I doing here? You know, what am I doing here and what is the business doing here? And as you said at the beginning, is the world better off because your business is in it? What's a really natural next question that I've been asking myself since we wrote the book is the world better off because I'm in it?
Hello, and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll hear conversations that generate one aha moment after another for you. There is an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. And on this podcast, you're going to hear from the people in that wave. Their words, their deeds, their incredible projects, their books are getting so well hidden by the negative noise that we're calling this wave a conspiracy of goodness. So welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Ulrich, founder of the mothership website to this podcast called The Goodness Exchange. It's a global website where you can have instant access to what's right with the world. News, articles, interviews, videos, and links that will put a spring in your step. And we're surely here to do that today. We've got an amazing guest, and we're going to start it on that spring in your step right now. Welcome, Andrew Winston.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Dr. Linda.
Okay, well, I got to tell folks a little bit about your work ahead of time before we dive in. Andrew has, his work is going to make an impact on our shared future that I find amazingly exciting. And it points to this giant wave that I'm talking about in the introduction. He's written a book with a co-author called Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. Well, what a novel idea. Andrew is one of the world's most widely read writers and a leading thinker in the sustainable business world. And by sustainable, I simply refer to a key question that the book asks right in the beginning. It asks business leaders to think about this. Is the world better off in the long term because your business is in it? This is the key question that's going to determine our shared futures. If the book Net Positive starts rapidly shaping corporate culture, goals, and practices, then we have a chance at a bright future. Andrew's other books on sustainable business strategies have sold over 250,000 copies. And you got to think about what category that's in: sustainable business practices. 250,000 copies. That is definitely part of a wave. His other two books are called Green to Gold and The Big Pivot. His co-author is Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever. And there's this lovely part in the book Net Positive where Paul describes having wished he'd had access to Andrew's first two books before he started his own journey to move Unilever in the right direction. Just a few other details. Andrew's books have been translated into 7 to 14 languages. And given our global turmoil at the intersection of climate change and politics and then economics, it's more than obvious that Andrew here, our guest today, was way ahead of his time. He's written articles for the Harvard Business Review, the MIT Sloan Management Review, and other amazing publications. And I can't thank you enough for sharing the insights about the world of industry and business and where we can take it. I'll welcome you again, Andrew. And let's go. Let's learn all about what we should know as consumers, what we could do to see ourselves as stakeholders in the world of industry as well. Give us a little gist of the book Net Positive.
Yeah. Well, I think you commented, before we started the film rolling, that there was a story that grabbed you in the book, and it's the opening story. And I think it does set the stage on what we're really talking about. And we kind of jokingly call it Why Mayo Beat Ketchup. And it's the story of the attempted hostile takeover of Unilever. Unilever is not as well known as a brand in the US. It's incredibly well known around the world, but the brands like Dove soap, and they own Ben and Jerry's and Seventh Gen and Hellman's mayonnaise. And in 2017, the CEO of what was Kraft Heinz and was part of a private equity group walked into my co-author's office, Paul, he was the CEO, and basically said, we're taking over all of Unilever. And the reason this was such a big deal was not just because it would have been the largest takeover in history, would have been the largest merger. It was just such a bad fit between these two companies. Unilever, for 100 plus years, had kind of a mission at its core, certainly pursued profit, but had this mission of cleanliness, of sustainability. And Paul had just spent 7 years building sustainability into the business in a way that no one really had done before at that scale. And we can get into the details of that, later. But someone walked in from a company that was private equity owned and was known. This was not like my statement, like there was articles about the CEO of the private equity firm that said, these are the guys that eat costs. All they want to do is cut cost, and that's their way to profit. And so there was this very different model of our main purpose is shareholder value in the short run, and we will cut costs and we will save, or we're trying to serve the world and serve stakeholders. And that's what you referred to. And we're all stakeholders, your employees, your customers, your suppliers, your communities that you operate in. And so the disconnect was huge. And the PE firm 3G had never lost a hostile takeover. And in a week, they did. And one of the main reasons was that stakeholders came out of the woodwork, including Greenpeace and investors and labor unions. All these people that are not fans of business normally came out and said, we want Unilever to keep its business model. This is the way we think companies should be operating. And it really pushed back. There's a lot about public perception in takeovers, and it kind of pushed back on 3G and Warren Buffett, who was part of the bid as well. And it failed. And, Unilever got to kind of move on and keep doing what it's doing. And it changed them somewhat. And we can talk about that. It wasn't like it wasn't completely hands off in what it did to the business to have this moment, this important moment. But their model kind of won out. And over the next 4 or 5 years, the two stocks and the two companies went in very different directions. And you would have done like 4 times better investing in Unilever that day when the takeover was attempted versus Kraft Heinz. So it really, I think, bore out that you want a business model that's taking into account more than just your shareholders, that isn't actually the best way to serve shareholders in the long run.
So just to make sure everyone understands where we're at on this, is that I was completely unaware of the story of Unilever and its commitment to all kinds of things, especially after Paul Polman took over, all kinds of things that make our world a better place. They really discontinued their connections with businesses that they just couldn't pull into a more sustainable mentality. And they bought companies like Ben and Jerry's that obviously were mission driven from the early 90s. So this really was probably a pretty monumental shift to see an organization like Unilever stay in charge of their direction.
Yeah.
And
it was a big deal.
The whole thing, not just slide into the quest for profit.
Well, I will tell you, just as someone I've been working in this field for 20 years, this overlap of business and environment. And the thing I think we can't get to every element of your bio is that I have an MBA. I came from business. I came from consulting. Boston Consulting Group was my earliest job. I come at this in a very business-like way, but those of us working on this topic, the idea of Unilever going down to a company that just was cutting costs was bad news. It was really going to be bad for the movement, because Unilever was really showing a better way, along with some others. But just for context, there's a survey every year by a company called GlobeScan, where they just ask hundreds of people around the world who are knowledgeable in this space, who's doing the best work. And Unilever has been number one in that survey for like 13 straight years. And there's usual suspects. You'll see Ben and Jerry's pop up, Patagonia, IKEA, a little company called Interface in Georgia we could talk about. The same group kind of pops up over and over again, but Unilever has been recognized. Doesn't make them perfect. They've got serious issues, plastics, use of resources, chemicals in products, everything. But they've been working on them, right? They try to move towards solutions that are systemically better for humanity and for the planet. And that's intention and action. And they're doing both.
So there's a part in the book when you say that this is actually right now, it's just lining up two sides, a battle for the soul of business. Yeah. Put that really, really succinctly for us. Like there's this side and there's that side.
Well, yeah, I mean, and we'll, I think, come back to this a few times about what's the kind of story, the narrative of the world that we're living in. And all of us have basically grown up in a world where the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder profits in the short run. And that's it. And the purpose of a government is the GDP or the stock market. And that's it. These very narrow measures. On the other side are people that want to build value over time, that want enterprises that serve the world and improve the well-being of everyone that they touch. I believe, and I think the data shows that those companies do outperform over time, but it's a different way of doing business. It's a fundamentally more human-centered, longer term, and multiple stakeholder. You care about more than just one group, the shareholders. It's fundamentally different.
And it does all come down to, I'm not sure all my life, or I since doing the Goodness Exchange, and I'm a champion of something I call the gratitude economy. It's this way that people are starting to, consumers, 69% identify themselves as values driven. And that is a gratitude economy that's developing. People are giving their business to people they're grateful for, people who are making the world a better place. And so I think we're at this juncture where most of us know that the stakeholders that most big businesses are constantly focusing on is shareholders. But talk to us just a little bit more for context, because it will come up over and over again. That this word stakeholders, that means the community where the plant is. That means the people in the supply chain that are little farmers in South America. Talk to me more about stakeholders.
I mean, it really isn't rocket science. And if you go back before this kind of modern economic era, the idea that your business, your organization, the work you did served many people was not strange at all. It was kind of the norm. It really is a modern era economic thing starting around the early 70s to say, all you got to focus on is the market and shareholders. And so, by the way, I just think operating in a stakeholder way, not only is it just better business, I think it's more rewarding and more fun, in a business that you're actually thinking about. I mean, this sounds silly to say out loud, but your customers, like, what do they need? I mean, the purpose of a business, and you've seen like the great thinkers in business for years, like the Druckers of the world, have said very simply, like, the purpose of a business is really to solve a problem. Find a customer that needs something and solve it for them. That's it, really. And the idea that your purpose is just to make money for investors means you could do anything, right? You could literally do anything. Illegal, legal, doesn't matter as long as it makes money. And the idea that you're serving customers and you're creating an environment for employees to make their livelihoods, to maybe spend their lives working for this organization, that you operate in communities that you should be contributing to, right? Not just through tax revenues, that is one way, but through the way you operate and the way you employ people and the way you treat them and your partners, your suppliers, your customers. And there's been a really deep change in what's expected of business in the last few years, more than I've seen in the previous 20. And a lot of it was circumstantial. The pandemic really kicked into high gear. This idea of, wow, we're all connected, and companies were faced a lot of tough questions. And the good ones like Unilever said, okay, we better help our suppliers and our customers survive this. If we've got more kind of cash at hand, we can help them, we can extend credit. There were all these kind of different conversations that happened about living in society, right? How are we taking care of our people in this health crisis? That's just a better way of doing business. And I think people will remember, right? The people will remember if their companies took care of them or not. The suppliers will remember, the customers, the communities, the governments that companies worked with, all of it. It is a tougher, more interesting, more complex, and just more rewarding way of doing business.
Yeah, we often forget that people at the top in leadership positions, we know that the founders, they didn't go into business like this, and nobody does that.
Well, I mean, look, people want to make a living. They go in to make money, of course.
Yeah. But I think that it's probably misguided to think that every business and all leadership teams are all just about this, about the shareholders. I think that what you've pointed out in the book is that there's a small but very quickly growing group of businesses that are really caring about the whole picture.
Well, they have to. We can talk about why.
Yeah, well, you make a point about how all of a sudden employees are part of the stakeholders because everybody's fighting so hard to keep the good ones.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, we're in a weird time, obviously. We have been for a few years. And there's layoffs going on in tech industry and what have you. But we're still like millions of people short from categories of jobs from before the pandemic. And there's starting to be really good analysis on why that is. And there's some really good, economists working on this. But there's some really obvious reasons. And besides the pandemic itself, and lots of people died, which is a reason, and people are taking care of family members, there's just wages. People said, you know what, I can't survive on the lowest wages. And so you're seeing companies like raise wages. And yeah, that is a circular thing with inflation. It can cause inflation, but it is how we lead to more people having enough and everybody having enough and everybody thriving to some extent. There are people that were working in really big companies at the minimum wage that were on food stamps, have been for years and years. Like, that's clearly something broken, right? So we're seeing, I think, this recognition that this better way of business is more humane, but you're just going to operate better, right? You're less turnover. Your people will come. They will be more interested in working. They'll be more engaged, which has huge value in companies, all of it. And you'll be able to get enough people, right? If you pay a little more. So we're in a deep transition, I think, in what it means to run a business. What kind of issues are you supposed to be talking about? And your employees' lives is one of them, but are you helping the LGBT community, racial equity, democracy, truth? All these issues are on the plate of the top executives. And for some of them, it probably is a bummer, right? It's so much more than they ever signed up for, but it's the nature of business now.
Well, before we move on, I got to ask you just a little bit about this partnership part, because that's a lovely, uplifting part of the opening of the book, where you talk about what happened during the pandemic and right after the hostile takeover, about how there's all this partnering going on that was just a win for everyone. Give us a little bit of that window into the world of business.
I think it's easy. Like, I live in this weird overlap, right? Between, I have an MBA, I worked in business, I wear a suit if I need to, and I guess environmentalist is not really the right word, but I believe in the environment and we need it so we can thrive. I'm very practical about it. And there's not a lot of people who kind of live in that overlap. And there's always this sense that if you're working with others, if you're solving these big problems, somehow it's anti-business. That's the kind of key challenge we always face. And again, I think the pandemic kind of challenged that. All of us were thrown into the reality that we kind of sink or swim together. I wish we had all come together more than we did. We got into battles over vaccines and masks and all of that. But in business, there was a sense of, wow, these supply chains and value chains we've built over years and years are really deeply connected and have some fragility because we depend on each other so much. So we better build each other up, right? And there were many examples of companies. Unilever, obviously that's one of the main companies we talk about. They're not the only one, but they extended credit to some of their customers so they could kind of keep surviving while their business was in trouble. They told their employees for a number of months they were guaranteed work, and even some of their indirect employees, like not there, that work for the companies that work for Unilever. So it was really extending the issue. One of my favorite stories really is that Medtronic, which is a medical device maker in the Midwest, they released the design of a portable ventilator because we didn't have enough. And auto companies were willing to convert some of their production, and they needed designs. They don't know how to build a ventilator. So Medtronic just put it out there publicly and said, go ahead, make more of them. That initially sounds like, well, that's horrible for business. You're giving away your designs. That's anti-business. But I think they kind of realized there wasn't going to be a good business environment or a good society if we didn't do something about the pandemic, right? It was going to take down the global economy, and it did to some extent. But it was these kinds of actions, people coming together, making way more things than they'd ever made. Unilever and others increased the manufacture of, hand sanitizer and swabs and all these things by 16,000%, ridiculous numbers, right? And that meant going to your suppliers in China, everywhere, places under pressure, places facing their own issues with the pandemic, and just radically increasing production of certain things and reducing others. And that was huge change. No business had never really done that at that pace. I had one company, an industrial manufacturer. Their Train Technology is the name now. They were in, Ingersoll Rand, and they kind of split. Train makes the air conditioning units at your home, and they make things for industrial. One of the top execs said, there were some things we had to do in those, weeks that we knew were coming as a change in business and how we dealt with our supply chain. But we thought we had years, and we all of a sudden had weeks. And I think one of the most amazing things that came out of the pandemic for business was how fast we discovered we could move when there was no choice. And I think that gave us some more optimism about tackling climate change, decarbonizing, moving to renewables, that we can go faster than we realize. It's happened at critical moments in history. The US produced more planes and tanks and things in World War II than they ever, by order of magnitude, than they thought possible, because they had to, right? And so it drives us. It is like the Kennedy moon landing thing, right? We're going to do it in 8 years. That's just the deal. And that's what's happening now. I think companies are setting the leaders are setting really big goals that they have no idea how to meet. That's how you do big things.
Mm-hmm. And that's the power of human collaboration as well. I mean, that's the greatest leaps in human history. That's one of the background stories for this phrase, the conspiracy of goodness, that we use at the Goodness Exchange all the time. It's a marvelous story from World War II about that phrase. But it does seem like humans are really good at backs to the wall kind of leaps of faith, like saying, oh, to the moon in 8 years. So when we come back, this is so important. I can't wait to explore more of this. Can we afford to be sustainable? Because that's usually the excuse, right? We can't afford to make these changes.
Right.
When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about that and a lot of other things, and really want Andrew to help us as consumers understand how this whole system works and how we can be a part of the solution as well. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Andrew some more. Hi, Dr. Linda here. Many of you know that the mothership website of this podcast is called the Goodness Exchange. And there you can find articles, a video library, podcasts, and content collections that point to what's right with the world. You can visit every day and you'll find the antidote to all the negative noise out there in the world. Okay, that solves the problem in our personal lives. We can choose what to give our attention to every morning and end our day with something positive. But what about our work environments? We need to feel supported and come alive in those cultures. But that's becoming harder and harder when most of us go to virtual work. And many of us who are working with others still never have shared positive experiences with our colleagues. By definition, culture comes from shared experience. So employees find it harder and harder every day to create an environment that attracts and retains other great people. Well, enter the Goodness Exchange and our extraordinary content, which celebrates an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows enough about yet. My team and I at the Goodness Exchange are making certain that employees of optimistic, values-driven companies have instant access to the positive news out there today, because science is telling us that it's time to start celebrating what's right with the world. And here's the thing, there are so many positive stories out there about astounding solutions to some of our world's biggest problems, about wonders and leaps in human potential. But most are going completely uncelebrated. Your culture can change that and can be changed by a new focus on goodness and progress. In fact, with all that negative noise out there, your work culture can be infused by a sense of flourishing. People can be sharing ideas and swapping stories of wonderful, ingenious solutions around the water cooler again. With instant access to good news, employees can stay on their feet and take turns being the one who makes opportunity out of setback. People who use the Goodness Exchange every day have a spring in their step. They radiate joy and confidence and creativity because they know a far more complete picture of what's going on in the world. If you'd like to chat about infusing the culture where you work with a tone of celebration, of goodness, and innovation and progress, let's hop on a Zoom. You can introduce us to your HR director or your chief of culture. You know, if used consistently, our content can give companies a way to turn something aspirational, like positivity, into a concrete way of being. Thanks. Talk to us at the Goodness Exchange about change and flourishing where you work. Okay, we're back. We're back here with Andrew Winston, the co-author of an amazing book called Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. This is such an enlightening book. I had such joy. I was listening to it in front of the fireplace this morning, all morning before interviewing Andrew. And I can't wait to talk to my husband about the little this and that I learned in it about a world that I'm not that familiar with. And so I'm hoping folks listening to this podcast who may not be in deep in industry are learning this and that about how they might actually participate in this wave and find some way to be a part of raising all the boats in the harbor up. So, Andrew, what about this sentiment? You and I talked a little bit about it yesterday in our pre-call about how our young kids, we both have college-age kids, and how our kids are sort of at the forefront. Your ideas about the millennials and the Gen Zers, how they're going to be driving this must-change movement in industry. Talk to us a little bit about your thoughts there.
Yeah, so my first book came out almost 17 years ago. It actually came out the day my second son was born. So I have this moment, and I have this odd 6'2" reminder of how long my career has been going, as he has become adult sized. It's a pretty long time now. And so when I started this work and then into my middle books before my latest, I've been talking about millennials as kind of this young new force. And I don't mean to be mean to millennials, but I have to tell them that they're now turning 40, the leading edge. They're not as young anymore. They're actually heading towards middle age. They have income, they have kids, part of the core of the economy now. And now it's Gen Z, right? And they're coming in. And there's been incredibly funny articles about older millennial managers trying to deal with Gen Z and not understanding them. I mean, this happens every generation, right? The generation below you don't really get. But there is a real difference between millennials, Gen Z, and the rest. And the data has shown it for years. Millennials have more belief or need for values in business. And there's, I think, lots of history as to why this came to be. Companies used to provide lifetime employment. My dad worked for IBM for 35 years. That contract really broke, right around the time millennials were kids and before they even got to the workforce. So you kind of have that whole idea of the CEO of you're your own business. And so they're making their own way, which means they can say, I want to work for places that I agree with, that help me grow, that I agree with the values. And both these generations are very clear on that. And Gen Z is even more, and I think even more directed about the fact that business should be solving really big problems and should manage their environmental and social issues. There's tons of surveys showing this, and it's changing the world. I think it's the number one reason that the sustainable business movement is unstoppable. There's ups and downs with economies and recessions and invasions, countries that take energy prices up. But fundamentally, there's a generational shift, and that's a shift in norms. And when that happens, there's no going back, right? They expect more of business for who they buy from and who they work for, I think most of all. That's not going backwards. There's no way. And so companies, I think that's the main reason they keep moving is, and I've talked to many companies, especially big service businesses, consultants, banks. I'll say, why do you care about this? They're like, well, we can't hire if we're not talking about our sustainability efforts or who we work with and how we work. And so it is driving enormous change and will continue to.
Now, while we're there, we might as well talk about purpose, because that is kind of at the core. I read a study recently about, I think it was USC and all their schools together. They did a survey with all the students. Yeah, I could be wrong on that university, but they did a survey of all their students and who wanted to have anything to do with sustainability in their major. And that was across all majors, math majors, English majors. And it was 79% wanted some connection to sustainability as an English major or what have you. And then we're looking at the millennials being the largest generation in history. What is it, 76 million or?
Oh yeah, it's huge.
Crazy thing. And that's just in the United States. So when we're there, we have to look at these people coming out of college very often don't want to work for the man. Just any old company. They really want to make a difference right out of the starting gate. Yeah. And so corporations have to think about purpose. Talk to us a little bit about the history of how that has gone on.
Again, it's really funny when I've written about purpose, and Paul, my co-author, has talked about it a lot. It's become really big in business, and most companies, a surprising number out there saying this is, deciding this is our purpose. And it's really not new. It's actually old. It's old fashioned, right? Again, before we had the purpose of business is shareholder value, companies kind of had a purpose, right? And so one of the examples I've used for years is Johnson & Johnson. They're a big conglomerate now, but their, I think, son or grandson of the founder, one of the Johnsons in the 1940s, he wrote a credo for the business and said, here's our thesis, here's our belief system. And it said, we're here to, help patients and help doctors, and we're going to help communities. And he went down through basically stakeholders. And the last one, the fifth or sixth, was, and our shareholders will earn a fair return. It wasn't like we'll earn more than possible. It was fair. And that showed that the purpose was improving people's health, right? That sounds kind of obvious. And you see more and more now. And I've even worked lately with mining companies. that are setting really big goals about mining improving the world. And at first, how could that be? That's a big hole that they dig, but we're going to need mining. We're going to need metals for things, even the clean economy. So you need mines to say, okay, how do we make it so that communities are better off because we've come in and we've found these metals that we need for our society and we've left them better off? Like, how do we set that goal? Right? That's the level of thinking that's net positive. And you're just seeing more and more of that now. And it's been proven it inspires people to have a purpose and to connect to their own purpose. If you've ever done that kind of hard work of like, why am I here? And it's not easy and it can change, right, over time. But if you can connect that to the purpose at work, then you really have something. If you can say, here's what I'm kind of uniquely good at, it's that, I think that Japanese phrase, ikigai, where it's like, what am I good at? What does the world need? What can I get paid for? Those kind of overlapping things. If you can figure that out and then say, how do I bring that to my work? You're pretty engaged. And I think you'll generally do better in your work, in your career. So it really does come down to, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? And what is the business doing here? And as you said at the beginning, is the world better off because your business is in it? What's a really natural next question that I've been asking myself since we wrote the book? Is the world better off because I'm in it? And I think it's a very kind of middle-aged question. I hit 50 in the beginning of the pandemic, and you always say hit 50, right? You don't say like, oh, I got to 50. It's like you hit it hard. And there's a little bit of okay, I'm more than halfway through my adult life. If I live an 80 plus year life, what am I doing? Right. And that's pretty common. And I just think the younger generations, they start that questioning earlier, and it's probably healthier.
Yeah, I think that's empowering for us as consumers, because if we feel like we look at that thing we're just going to spend our money on, do we really need it? Does the world really need it? What happens to it after we're done with it? There's a little sidetrack I'd like to go on. I'd like to hear your thoughts on. We interviewed this amazing woman named Jessica Schreiber. Have you heard of her? She's the woman who's taken over all the waste stream for all the textiles in New York City. She's like,
yes, I don't know her personally, but I mean,
it's unbelievable what she's doing. In the show notes, we'll refer people to that interview. It was very recent. Anyway, she starts right off in this interview pointing out that one of the biggest mindset shifts that we need to make in industry is that companies should be responsible for the whole life of a thing they produce. But right now, they're getting away with selling it to us, and then we're responsible for how it happens. And she said, what happens to it when we're done with it? And that is such a design flaw. If companies are not thinking about what actually happens when the consumer is done with it, it's just plain and simple a design flaw.
For many years, there's kind of leaders in design, kind of design thought leaders. Like there's a pair that have worked together, Bill McDonough and Michael Braungart, and they wrote a book, Cradle to Cradle. That's one of the kind of important books in the field. I think every designer gets it now. It was written in early 2000s, and they've asked, like many others, what's the real problem here? And it's fundamentally a design problem. Most of our issues are a design problem of the system that we're in. And most of the footprint of a product is created or set in stone from the design phase, right? You've designed it, and now you got to go get the materials to make it. And is it ready to be recycled or reused, or does it just sit in a landfill? Like, these are all design problems, and they're systemic design problems, which are really, really challenging, but pretty exciting, to try to solve. And so I think we all need a design mindset to some extent.
Especially when we're deciding where to spend our money. I mean, that's the simplest way that consumers can influence this is, think about where you're spending your money, and your money is kind of like a vote. And if you know a little bit more about a company's ethos and whether they're, so that brings us, if you know a little bit more, as if that's knowable, about a company's ethos and their impact, negative or positive, talk to us. We can't get this close to greenwashing and not talk about greenwashing. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you recommend we consider that whole topic.
Look, it's really difficult. I'm never probably as accusatory about greenwashing as maybe others are, because I've worked with business so closely. I know that businesses are just an assemblage of people, and most of them are trying to do right, and they don't want more pollution in the world or people to starve, or not many really want that. And there's a lot about the system that we're trapped in, that even the top executives are trapped in. I think it's really easy to put kind of the burden on consumers and say, you just got to buy differently. And that's kind of where the environmental pressure has been for decades, right? There's all those books, 50 Simple Things You Can Do and 1001. And there's truth. We have to make choices. But what's become clearer, and you see the real and kind of environmental movement leaders like a Greta Thunberg, she's the Gen Z leader, right, from Sweden. You see them making a much more, I think, nuanced case that what has to change is systems. And that means things like policy. That means, how the system works. You can't just say to people, you should reduce your footprint and you should only buy recycled content stuff if it doesn't exist or there's not a recycling system, right? So putting the burden on each of us has been a way, in some sense, for kind of vested interest to say, so we don't have to change. It's up to you. Car companies for years said, well, nobody will buy an electric car, but you haven't made them, right? So there's this circular argument. And what really moves things is when you get this combination, and you're seeing it in electric vehicles right now, this combination of the technology price coming way down, the legislation and regulation pushing it, saying you got to raise the fuel efficiency standards, and making cars that people want. And Elon Musk, which I don't want to spend much time on because I think I don't know what's happened to him, but he's kind of lost his mind a little. He did an awful lot to make electric cars sexy and exciting, and people enjoy driving a Tesla. And then it's built to now there's many, many companies creating great electric vehicles that are just a better experience, right? So when you've created an option for people where it's better and they got to have some knowledge and go seek it out, then they're going to be excited they bought the greener product. There's just kind of a hangover from 20, 30 years ago where greener products sucked, right? They didn't work as well. Like two-sided paper got stuck in copiers, it didn't work. And so we kind of have that hangover that isn't really true anymore. Most of the greener products, they try to make them better, right? And I think that's the way we get there, so that people both are looking for it, willing to spend more upfront sometimes. And we should, we can talk about that. And companies are providing it, and the governments and companies are creating the system. So the footprint is as low as possible. It has to all come together. It's not just on us.
Right. And then you're back to this notion, which you guys shine a lot of light on, about how companies often feel they can't afford it. They can't afford to be focusing on sustainability. How should we think about that?
Yeah, I'll try to do this quickly because this is like my favorite and most hated topic in my life, because I get asked, well, doesn't it cost too much? How can we do this? Like daily for 20 years. I'm not really exaggerating. Through my interviews, talks, comes up every time. And so there's two kind of levels to talk about this. And let me, I guess, start with the macro. It's used often at the kind of economy level. You'll hear people say, if we tackle climate change, it'll destroy the economy. It's the same argument as within companies, but it starts up there. And that's just increasingly ludicrous. And Paul and I kind of make the case that we've hit this tipping point now where it's far more expensive to do nothing on something like climate change than do something, for two reasons. The cost of doing nothing just keeps rising because it's incredibly expensive to have a third of Pakistan underwater or California burning, et cetera. And on the cost side, renewables, EVs, all that stuff has gotten so much cheaper that we're stupid for not doing it. So that equation has really changed. And so when you hear someone say this will destroy the economy, do not listen to that. This is how we grow the economy. Any economy that's stuck on fossil fuels in 10, 20 years is in trouble, because we're just now at better technologies. It'd be like saying 30 years ago, I'm going to keep my typewriter. I don't get this whole PC thing, right? So there's the macro level. And then this is a longer conversation about what I see in companies about how they make investment decisions. And the short version is we use tools like return on investment or internal rate of return. And we say, if we put money in, what's the rate it comes back? And what we're good at is saying how much cash comes back, right? If we invest in this change in business, how much will we save? What we're not good at all is measuring the additional value of something creates that it's hard to put a number on, right? Your employees are happier. You've pleased your customers. The communities are happier. You're more resilient. You're more flexible as a business. There's lots of benefits to something like putting renewables in your business that aren't just how much did you pay for energy. And we're really bad at that, consistently bad at it. And I can give you kind of examples of what that does to decision-making in businesses, but it is a kind of a fatal flaw that we don't really get the value we're creating. So you end up with this, oh, this costs more. And it's like, but what do you mean? Like cost more versus what? What's the benefit of doing it? And we see these kind of things in our own lives, right? If you just took a short-term cost benefit, you'd probably never go to college. It's like 4 years of just spending money without making any money, right? Like there's all sorts of things you wouldn't do. Wouldn't have a kid. They're really expensive for a number of years. So I think it is about taking a longer view of costs and benefits, and we're getting better at it, but we need more work.
Okay, so here we are with one of your right at the doorstep of one of your concepts that you write about, blowing up boundaries.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the order of battle that we kind of determined, how do you build a company that improves the well-being of everyone they touch, which I'm not sure I've said yet as kind of that's what a net positive company looks like.
Circle back to that. Give us that.
Yeah.
I know where you're going. Give us that in a nutshell.
Yeah. I mean, is the world better off, but more specifically, are you improving the well-being of everybody that you impact? And that is much broader, especially for big companies, than just your employees and your customers. You have a stake in how does your sector impact the world? What's the policy positions of your industry and your company on the kinds of policies we need to reduce carbon or help improve nutrition or whatever the category you're in is? What's your contribution to these systems that overconsume, that we don't have recycling for? There's these bigger questions, right? And the smarter companies, the leading edge ones, are diving into those. And it's why at core Net Positive is so much about partnerships, because the bigger questions you can't tackle alone. There's no way, no matter how big you are, no company's big enough. And so that's how you get to this kind of definition of how do we work together to improve the well-being of everyone. So where were we going with that? Besides, what was the question?
I know that you have 5.
Oh, the boundaries, right? The breaking boundaries. Yeah. So in building this kind of net positive business, we start with purpose, your own and the company's, but kind of right after that is what kind of goals, what's your vision, where are you shooting for? And why we talk about blowing up boundaries is that you start with your own business. You do. You can't start with, we're solving hunger, we're solving waste. You start with something like, can we make this factory zero waste? But the reason you're doing that, or the reason you're setting a net zero carbon goal, is because there's a larger problem. You're bringing outside in, the world into business. And for really, I think for many, many decades or maybe centuries, all you really needed to worry about was your own kind of 4 walls, because there weren't really constraints yet in the world. It seemed like infinite resources, but we're kind of bouncing up against the limits. So there has to be this outside in view. And that means blowing up your mental boundaries about, when I think of my own factor, my own operation, what am I thinking about? Is it just the operation, or how it starts to tie into the broader world? And so you start with setting these big goals because there's larger problems, and finding ways to make it more profitable. If you make a factory zero waste, it tends to make it more efficient. You tend to save money. And then you're ready to say, okay, for us to really get to zero waste, we got to think about our suppliers and our customers, and we need partnerships to solve the waste problem in our sector or in this particular material. So you have to start with blowing up the boundaries in your head about where are we and what are we focusing on, so that you can set really aggressive goals for yourself and then be ready for the bigger conversations.
So that kind of leads me to another concept that I thought was interesting. I read the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, at least skim it for the big ideas every morning. And it's the constant talk about growth when we already don't have enough planet.
Right.
Like, how can those two concepts live together?
Look, it is the single hardest question, I think, in our economy, in our society. And we don't have easy answers. I think the interim solution I've written about in multiple ways, and we talk about in the book, is that you want the businesses that are doing this better, the ways of making something that are much more sustainable. You want those businesses to grow, right? You want them to take market share. We're going to need growth. We just hit 8 billion people on the planet. And I'm old enough to remember when we got to 5 billion when I was like a teenager. My dad remembers 2, I think, right? I mean, we have grown immensely. So we're going to need more stuff. There's going to be another billion or 2 billion. But there's this idea of decoupling, like, can we provide well-being without more material? Things like renewables don't use fossil fuels, don't create more fossil fuel pollution. And they have their own footprint, but over time, you kind of offset that. And so there's this larger sense that we want growth of the companies doing things right, of the products. You want people to buy more jackets from Patagonia when they need a jacket, because there's a lifetime guarantee to fix it, so you don't have to buy another one. It lasts longer. You want to buy the lasting things. All that said, there are just physical limits to the planet. We are on a finite planet. And so the really hard question is what you kind of intimated, which is, what do we really need? And by we, I think we have to have a harder conversation among the kind of billion or so of us that are the wealthiest. We use almost all the resources. We've created almost all the pollution. And we have to have a harder conversation looking at each other and in the mirror about what do we really need. And we get to this quote in the book from Gandhi where he says, the rich must live simply so the poor can simply live. And it doesn't mean that everything's an exact trade-off or there's only one pie. It doesn't mean that exactly, but we have to free up some leeway in resource use and in how we operate in the world so that people who don't have anything can get to sufficiency, can get to enough. And that's going to be difficult. And it's one of the reasons that inequality is, I think, besides climate change, the other existential challenge. We are in, I think, almost first in history time of 40 years of just all the money going to the top. And that is creating tensions, serious tensions, right? And it makes it hard to work together, right? If people feel like we're not in this together, it's hard. So these are really hard conversations. There's no harder conversation than what do we really need, right? And what makes us happy? And it's not really more stuff. Once you get past a basic level, and by basic, I mean, you have food, you have shelter, your kids can go to college, you can take a vacation. I don't mean like subsistence, like enough, a good life.
Yeah.
More stuff has been shown to be disconnected from happier, right? We are in an epidemic of loneliness, unhappiness, like the pandemic screwed us up, all of that. More stuff isn't going to help, so more connection does, feeling more connected. And that's what we have to think about growing. How do we grow the connection and meaning and not just stuff?
Beautifully put. Absolutely beautifully put. I think it goes with something I found interesting that I think it has connection to how we run our daily lives. You're a family man, and you and I talked about our kids and how they've influenced us and all that yesterday a little bit. And I love this quote from the book. You said, anything we can't do forever is by definition unsustainable. And I love concepts like that are so simple. You can't unsee them and that one really struck me. Like, I'm getting near retirement age. I can't continue to whatever. There's a million things in my life that I was doing through my 30s and 40s that I think are not sustainable once I am retired, right? Like, if we really just looked at the things we do or the things we purchase, or talk to me a little bit more about how you see that statement. Anything we can't do forever is by definition unsustainable.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds really obvious, but there was a really funny kind of thought experiment I saw, a number of years ago. It was like an energy expert and basically pointed out that energy use on the planet had grown about 3% a year for like hundreds of years, right? Yeah, as we changed technologies, as we've grown population. And if you take that 3% a year out, and I forget the exact numbers, but like in 400 years, we would need all the energy the sun produces, like all of it. In another few hundred years, we'd need like the solar system. I mean, eventually you need the galaxy, right? Like, it is by definition impossible to keep growing really at any percentage increase, right? This is the problem of exponential growth. And I mean, yes, we're a long way from that, but it does mean that resource use, the growth of it has to flatten out and even start to go negative, meaning this is why you hear this word a lot lately in business, regenerative. And it's very similar in that positive, close enough, but it means, are you restoring through your business? Probably one of the best ways to picture that is through agriculture. There's ways of growing crops or raising cattle where you're capturing carbon into the soil. It's getting richer. It's getting better. You're making the world cleaner. There are buildings with construction materials that capture pollution. It's how do you create a regenerative model? So you're improving things through your existence, right? And that's how you start to kind of square the circle on the fact that we can't go indefinitely at an exponential rate. It doesn't work. And it's really hard for people to get their heads around that. And I always wonder if like humanity always feels like we're near the end, or this is the most important time in history, and every generation feels that. But I do think we're at something a little different now in the 21st century, which is other limits we ran up to in previous times in humanity were regional, right? Like stories of Easter Island or particular places. It's now global. Right? Like, we're at the place where we can empty the oceans. I remind people, I'm in awe of what humanity can do. Like, I think people think if you're sustainability, you hate business. If you fly in and out of like a really big city, it is unbelievable how many of us there are, what we've built, the fact that have you flown over like a country that's all farming? Like, it's just, the scale is remarkable. The ocean looks infinite when you look out, and we can absolutely empty it. You got to be in awe of that. I saw a comedian say, you got to be impressed that 4.8 billion years and we broke it, like that we had that ability, but that means we also can fix it. Right. And so we have to understand that there are limits. There's debates. There's people who talk about abundance. Yes. we can make the world more abundant, but there is just only so much fresh water. There only exists so much, only so much fresh air, only so much stable climate, right? There's just only so much. And that isn't going to be healthy. We got to find a different way.
While we're here, you also have another quote in the book, which I love. I might even put it somewhere in this office. You refer to the fact that Desmond Tutu said once, when asked whether he was optimistic or pessimistic, he said, "I am a prisoner of hope." And I kept getting that feeling all through your book as well. I mean, just so people understand, you're hitting the mountains and the valleys in this book. But on balance, I felt like there's people on this, and there's a growing number of people on this. And I also got the impression, which we shouldn't skim over, that this is not optional. Any business that's not taking a hard look at whether what they're doing is making the world on balance a better place is just like paddling a surfboard, waiting for the wave to come. When are you gonna dive in and do it? But it's not gonna be optional because of the things we've already talked about. The generations, millennials and Gen Zs, will not stand for anything else.
And technology moves, norms move, technology moves. People can fight it. The fossil fuel industry has slowed progress, right, against climate change for years. But now the auto companies are going to build only EVs within 10, 15 years. So that takes oil demand down, right? So there's deep change coming. We don't know what AI is going to do to our jobs. I think the upside is AI is going to help us make a radically more efficient world, buildings, transportation, all of it. I mean, this is again how we slow down this exponential use of resources by using really great technology. And some of that's already happening. Google and others have used AI to make data centers far more energy efficient. And the AI will discover some pattern that we don't see really. And will turn down or turn up the temperature at a time. And they're like, why is it doing that? But it saves money, right? If you've played with Chat GPT, if any listeners have the AI chatbot, it's pretty freaky. And I think we're at a moment of some deep technological change that we're on the verge of that we don't know what's going to happen. And I'm looking for the good side of it, the stuff that's going to really help us solve big problems.
Now, there's a good interview I can refer people to after this one in our library with a guy named Mo Gaudat, who was the CBO for Google X for years. Yeah. And that interview just really opened up my eyes to the possibilities of AI, even to the extent that he knows we can teach AI to love and we can teach it happiness and all these things. It's really a sparkling interview about what's possible with AI.
We're probably pretty far from that. I don't know, but I think we're pretty close to radical pattern identification and efficiency and just things we don't fully see, right? And I mean, we're not quite there yet, but you can imagine if all the cars had auto control and computers, just how much more efficient the roads would be. When the light turns green, everybody would start moving at the same time, right? You would so much less of the lag that happens through human. I mean, we're a ways away, but I think you can see, I imagine a day where there are no accidents. There shouldn't be. Cars shouldn't run into each other unless someone takes over and does the wrong thing. I mean, or it won't be none, but there'll be so many fewer, right? There's some really upside things here that we should be excited about.
Absolutely. So I want you to go through a little storytelling here with some of the time we have left.
Yeah.
You mentioned a few people in the book that have some pretty good stories. Tell us a little bit about the Ray Anderson story.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just did an interview with the Interface Foundation and the people working that had worked with Ray Anderson. So for people who don't know, he was really the first kind of major CEO of a kind of more typical, energy and material intensive company to say, wow, we got to do this sustainability thing. And it was 25 years ago. He had what he called a spear in the chest moment. He was a fairly religious guy, but he was a kind of rural Georgian. He had created this company that makes carpet interface flooring. It still exists. I think it was about $1 billion at that time. So it wasn't huge. It wasn't tiny. And there had been companies like Patagonia and others that were in logical spaces to be thinking green, right? Like they were garden companies or outdoor. And this guy made carpet tiles. And the story is longer, but he had this moment. He read like a book, a story, and realized, wow, I use only fossil fuel-based products. It's all plastic, basically, and carpets. And I'm just using up the world. And he became this incredible advocate. And so I think the ability for like Polman, my co-author, to then do this at Unilever, 10, 15 years after Ray started was partly made possible by these kind of the early guys, some of those early CEOs who said, this is how we got to do it. And I think he was a real influence over so many people, over me. I got to meet him. He died about, I guess, 12 years ago now, but he had gone all over the world talking to people. And he had this way of kind of explaining what sustainability meant and why it mattered that I found so compelling. And I'll tell you one quick story from him. I was at a conference he was speaking at, and a kid, I mean, I'm old enough now to say kid for grad student even, or like undergrad, but a young guy stands up and says, I'm in business school. And how do I know if my professors get this, understand how to teach sustainability? And Ray said, go to the board and draw a circle with a square inside and ask the professor which one's the planet and which one's business, which one's the economy and which one's society. And I will tell you that to me is the fundamental aha of working in sustainability, that we are taught that the economy is everything. And then environmental and social stuff is this niche. There's someone who works on it within a company. And it sounds so obvious that we are within the planet and like the business is only possible by virtue of stuff from the planet. Everything we have comes from stuff grown or cut down or dug up. And it sounds so obvious when you say it, but that took years of deprogramming for me to really internalize and think about how different that means you run a business. And he had just such a great way of conveying that in very simple terms, because it was kind of like his way. He's like, this is how I understand it. And Interface set targets like we see now, zero carbon positive, years ago, way before almost everybody else. And they keep doing it. You know, they've got a tile carpet product now that is carbon negative because it uses bio-based materials that basically capture carbon in their growing and in their making. That's the kind of stuff they do, and they're still out there influencing the world through what they do.
I just want folks to know that anything that you and I have referred to, we do a beautiful job on show notes and links in the show notes. So there'll be a full article on the Goodness Exchange built around this interview, and we'll give people a link to every single thing you and I are talking about. I want you to comment on one other leader who I've also interviewed, Paul Hawken. He has a great role in this. Tell us just a little bit about Paul Hawken.
Because the sustainability world is really tiny, the reason Ray Anderson had a spear in the chest was he read Paul Hawken's book. The first book he read, really, someone handed it to him. I know the guy who did this. The story was there was an industry event that Ray was talking to, and someone said, talk about your environmental plan. This was in the 90s. And he realized he had nothing to say. And so then one guy who worked at the company who cared about this stuff handed him this book that had come out a few years earlier. 92, I think, so 30 years ago, Paul Hawken wrote this book, The Ecology of Commerce. It is beautifully written. He's a beautiful writer. He had run a kind of garden flower chain store. I mean, he was a businessman. And he wrote this beautiful book about kind of the whole idea that we are within nature, right? And that we can overuse resources, we can run out, and that business has this critical role. And it really changed. I think I put that up there with Silent Spring as one of the key books that changed the discussion, because he was the first to say, not just chemical companies, companies are evil. Look, they're killing birds, which was kind of Silent Spring, but to say companies are part of the ecosystem. And yeah, they can destroy things, but they're part of us, right? And they have to find a different way. And if you read that book now, I don't feel like I'm writing stuff that's that different 30 years later. Like, there's only so many ways to talk about this. There's only so many ways to talk about business in general, right? Strategy books have been the same for decades, fundamentally. And he just had a beautiful way. And he's written a more recent stuff. There's a whole regeneration thing. There's a whole kind of study that he started and did about what are the best ways for us to take carbon out of the world, and how do you rank them? Like, what's the kind of estimate for the most we can do? And building, solar and wind is an obvious one, but there's some really interesting things in there. Like the third or fourth highest leverage point that his study came up with was educating girls around the world, because that's the number one way to control population and to get women into the workforce. And you end up with just a more sustainable society. Those are the kinds of insights that I think he's always brought to the table. He's been a real leader.
Yeah, he's super gentle. I was just emailing him last night that we're going to for sure turn people on to the episode that we did with him. It's about regeneration. I know he's very famous for Project Drawdown, which is what you were referring to. Yeah. But we've mentioned regeneration twice now, and that's this gentle, graceful, yet very powerful interview I have with him. We'll put it in the show notes for sure, because Paul Hawken is I know that he doesn't think of himself like this. He's so humble and so forth, but we've all got to start out on our own journeys and be sort of fearless. And you talk about courage in the title of the book.
Yeah.
Everybody conjuring up some courage to make a step of their own, right?
Right. That's right.
So as we wrap up here, I can't thank you enough, but there's a few things that I'd love to ask people, and I know that you can turn us on to something with each of these three questions that changes us today permanently. Okay, the first one is, what do you really wish people knew?
Well, I kind of described it already. Core, I wish people knew the box and the circle, like really got that the economy and our society is a subset of the world. You don't have to be a huge tree hugger. It's just reality. And that changes your thinking. If everyone knew that, it would really change our thinking about how connected we all are and how much we rely and why something like biodiversity matters, right? Like the species out there. I guess related to that, I also just wish they knew that the idea that we have to first and foremost maximize profit, improve the GDP is a story. And we can tell different stories. It is one story, right? In society, it's one narrative. It isn't the only one. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can tell a different story. That's what I kind of wish people knew, that they're not locked in. We decide this, right? We decide what is a business and what is a government for. We decide. So let's change it.
And my last question is, what would have to happen next, in your view? Actually, it's my second to the last question. What would have to happen next to have the view that you and Paul are putting out in this book, Paul Polman? By the way, I need to tell people, I'm not sure I told this in the opening, but I was connected to you guys by an interview that I heard with the most brilliant Jane Goodall. And she is singing the praises of this book like nobody's business. And gosh, if people know who Jane Goodall is, that is some seriously high praise. Yeah,
it was. I told you before, Paul knows more people than anyone I've ever seen, and he knows Jane. But I've met a lot of CEOs and leaders and what have you. But I got an email from Jane Goodall about how great the book was. I just found, it just tickled me in a way I can't really describe, right? Like, she's just exciting as a figure because she just did something so important and so unusual to connect us to the natural world and show us these creatures are pretty darn close to us. And that, I think, changed people's view of the world, right? I think it really did.
I'm hoping to interview her at some point in the near future. The last thing, I guess, tell us about your vision. What should we know the world would look like if it went your way? If it went this way that you hope it will go, that you see it needs to go, it must go. What does that world look like for us all?
I didn't answer what has to happen next.
Yeah, what has to happen next? For gosh sakes, let's turn people onto that first.
I mean, there's a lot of things, right? Like I said before, this is about us individually, governments, business, but I mean, we put courage in the subtitle of the book because I just think what has to happen next is business leaders in particular have to show courage. We didn't get into this, but there's something called the anti-woke backlash going on, where companies that care about this and banks that say we're going to invest in companies that really think about environmental and social issues, what's called ESG, they're getting attacked politically, saying, you're progressive. It's inherently progressive. And there's many of them saying, no, it's just a better way of doing business. It's just, this is our screen. I don't worry too much about investors changing their path because they're getting attacked, because they go where they think the money is. And they think this is a better way of looking at risk. So, but they need courage to stand up to bullies from wherever, government, NGOs that may be asking for the wrong thing. There's cynics out there that aren't really helpful. We talk in the book about cynics versus critics, and you want to invite in critics. They're the ones that help you. But cynics that just say everything you do is wrong, it's just not helpful. And you need courage to kind of push back in the right ways, and courage to say, we don't know. We don't know how we're going to get there, but we got to decarbonize by 2030, 2040. So that's the thing that has to happen next in business. It's just leaders feel like they can act together and they have the courage to do it. The future and what it looks like. I have this kind of odd story. I start out all my speeches. I do a lot of keynotes. And I show a picture of LA, that of the cleanest air that is, and it's almost unrecognizable as a city because you normally picture smog and you see these mountains in the background. I will ask Americans, what city is this? And most of them guess Denver. And I'm like, this is LA. And I say, this was the cleanest day probably in LA history. And I show a picture of New Delhi around the same day, Milan, all these. And you can probably guess when this was. It was like, the cleanest day these cities had seen in many, many, many years. And it was about second week of April of 2020, right? The economy, we had stopped. And I use this to say not, well, this is the great way to get to clean air. We'll just stop the economy. But to say more that we actually got a vision, and sustainability has done kind of a poor job of painting what it looks like. We talk about there's climate and it's going to kill us. And there was a moment of like, oh, this is what it would look like if everything's powered by renewables and everybody drives EVs. And you would not think, oh, my kid with asthma has to worry about going outside. You would just be like, oh, the air is clean, of course. And the water's clean. And we just forget like what we're talking about this all for. You get lost in these details about what's my carbon footprint and go, we're trying to build a thriving world. And so imagine this kind of world where the cities look like this. And instead of basically 99% of people in the world in cities are breathing polluted air, they're not, they're healthier. And imagine that in those cities and the community supporting cities, the farming and mining communities, that everyone makes a living wage and they have enough, right? Like that's what this looks like. And it is doable, right? The world has reduced the percentage of people in dire poverty dramatically. The number of people still rises because we keep growing so fast, but like the percentage has dropped in 100 years radically. We've had huge successes and things like immunizations, that we've pushed around the world, hand washing, these really basic things. There's many fewer kids dying that don't need to die, right? There's all these things happening. We can end dire poverty. We can make it so everyone has enough. There is enough to go around. And that's what this looks like. And so I try to get people to just picture living in this kind of clean world. It's not impossible, right? We got a vision. We got a few days where we saw it. And I just want people to kind of keep that in mind.
That is a great place to pause this conversation. I'm going to purposely use the word pause because we only got to a fraction of the questions that you and I had talked about. So I hope you'll come back and talk to us again one day.
Sure. Happy to.
Well,
can I point people to where to get more stuff?
That's what I was just going to ask you. I get interviewed a lot and they're always saying, if you self-promote, we will take that part out. And I'm thinking, why do you want to talk to me?
Well, I mean, if we're trying to make the world, I'm trying to make the world better, but I have a living to make, this is what I do, but I ask people to check out my site is easy. It's andrewwinston.com. You can sign up there for my blog. Seems like such a dated word now, but I repost articles that I write at Harvard or MIT or other places. And it's not that many a year. I'm trying to do better once a month, but you can sign up there and get it through email. And then there's a site for the book, netpositive.world. That has clips, that has links to where you can buy all the different language versions all over the world, all of it. And there's a couple tools there as well, something called the readiness assessment to ask yourself some questions as a business that I think is really useful. So, check both of those out.
Beautiful website. Yeah, I can really vouch for that. One more time, what would that be? Because it's a great website.
Yeah, it's netpositive.world.
Great. Well, I tell you, I can't thank you enough for coming on the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. It's very clear you are.
I love the name. We need positive conspiracies. It's great.
I had a thought leader one day share with me this story from World War II of the conspiracy of goodness, that little phrase. And I said, oh my gosh, that's what's happening here. Because we've been writing about people like you and all the goodness happening in the world for 10 years now at the Goodness Exchange. And gosh, we can have that kind of conspiracy too, can't we?
Yep. And someday you can tell me how you went from dentist to conspiracy of goodness.
That's another story. Okay, right. Well, thank you so much, Andrew Winston. Please connect with Net Positive in any way you can. The movement, there is a movement called that. Yep. And we can all be part of a future that we can share and be really happy with. I hope all the connections to goodness and progress carry you through your week and you start finding all the joy and wonder that we've been talking about. Thanks. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thanks for having me.